the topic of the trafficking of women for marriage purposes and also children as well. So just to let you know that this episode contains discussion of abuse, kidnapping, suicide, those sorts of topics. If you're uncomfortable or you don't really want to listen to something as upsetting or disturbing as that, I suggest skipping this episode and listening to one of the much lighter episodes that we've done in the past. So this isn't a topic that just sort of occurred to me randomly, although it seems to have come out of nowhere. Actually, in China over the past few years, there have been a number of very high-profile human trafficking cases that have been brought to the attention of the public, usually via a viral social media post or something like that. So I want to talk about two cases in particular, again, one about female trafficking and one about child trafficking, and use these as sort of like a framing for the larger discussion around the problems of human trafficking in China, specifically what it's caused by, how it's being dealt with, and how the public reacts, and what the cultural aspects of trafficking are. Why is it still a problem, and what can be done about it? So we're going to start first by talking about the case of the female victim in this story. In January of 2022, a vlogger was traveling around Jiangsu province where he came across a woman in a village. This woman was a mentally handicapped woman who was chained by the neck with a metal chain to an outhouse in a small village. She wasn't properly dressed for the weather, and when he approached her, she sort of like recoiled from him in fear. She wasn't able to speak or communicate at all, and she just seemed very sort of like feeble and afraid, essentially. After a while, he was able to sort of track down this woman's husband, who basically explained that, she's mentally disabled and I've chained her up for her own good so that she doesn't hurt anyone, and then proceeded to show this vlogger the 8 children that this woman had born for him. Now, this video immediately sparked an outcry on social media with demands from the public to bring the man, the woman's husband, to justice and to investigate her case further. And people immediately suspected that it was a case of human trafficking, that this woman was chained up perhaps so that she couldn't run away. Even if that wasn't the case, it's clear that this woman was being abused, and this was an issue of sort of women's rights in China. So at first, the local authorities dismissed trafficking concerns, saying that the couple had a legitimate marriage certificate and that they just had marriage troubles. Authorities also repeated her husband Dong Jimin's claims that he had locked up Huamei because she had schizophrenia and was prone to violent fits. Luckily, this only made the public even more upset, and so an actual investigation was launched, which eventually uncovered the truth that Huamei was a woman who had been kidnapped as a teenager from her village in Yunnan province and then sold originally to a man in Jiangsu province for around 5,000 yuan, which is around £300 or $600 at the time. A year later, she was sold again, and this time to Dong's parents, who were looking for a bride for his son, and then she was basically kept prisoner. People don't know how long she was chained up for, but she was forced to have 8 children for him between 1999 and 2020. That's sort of all the background that we know about the case. The rest is sort of hush-hush, but we'll talk about the outcomes of that case later on in the episode. I just wanted to pick out a few things from the story. First of all, something to note is that the woman is originally from Yunnan province. Yunnan is a province that's going to come up a few times along with a couple of other provinces as a source of trafficked women and children. Also, the idea of this woman just being chained in a outhouse in a village and sort of no one in the village doing anything about it or reporting anything untoward towards the police. This sort of attitude as well we'll be discussing later on in the episode. So let's sort of talk about the second case first before we move on. The child trafficking case that sort of became a big viral sensation in China was that of Xuezhou, who is a 15-year-old boy who posted a video to Douyin, I believe in 2021, Douyin being the Chinese version of TikTok, and he posted it with the following message. Hello everyone, I am Xuezhou and I'm looking for my biological parents. I was born in between 2004 and 2006, and around the age of 3 months old, I was bought by my parents, my adoptive parents, in Datong in Shanxi province. I'm healthy, don't have any congenital physical defects or diseases. I don't have any obvious birthmarks or scars. At the age of 4, my adoptive parents passed away due to an accident. I'm now living in Nangong, Xingtai, in Hebei province. I study in Xuezhou. I wish I'd found my biological parents sooner to make up for what I missed. I hope you can help me spread my message so that those who suspect they might be my parents can see it. His tragic story immediately drew lots of followers. His adoptive parents, had died in a fireworks accident when he was 4 years old, and his grandparents had sent him to a boarding school where he was bullied for being an orphan and also molested by one of his teachers. So he'd had a very harsh upbringing, but he still seemed fairly bright and hopeful despite that. He was also inspired by another case, which we'll talk about a bit later, of someone else who was able to find his biological parents and be reunited with them. Armed with sort of the backing of all of his followers on social media who wanted to follow his story, and basically his vaccination records and the knowledge that he had been sold in a hotel in Datong for 5,000 yuan, Liu and the police were eventually able to track down his biological parents. However, the story takes a sort of dark and very tragic turn, even more tragic at this point. So Liu meets his biological parents, and not only does he find out that they're no longer together, and in fact his father had remarried twice since giving him up, but in fact he had not been kidnapped as he had suspected, but he had actually been sold by his parents. He discovered that he was the result of an unwanted pregnancy. His parents were not married at the time, so they used the money that they got from the sale of him as a baby to pay for their wedding and for their living expenses. So Liu was obviously completely heartbroken by this, but still wanted to kind of create a relationship with his parents. So he was trying to keep in contact with them, but they kept sort of like brushing him off. So he asked his father if he could help him out with some living expenses because, you know, he was working and studying and just needed a hand. After which his father blocked him on social media. Liu decided to take his parents to court because child trafficking, if you are the person who sells the child, is still a punishable offense. At this point, the internet also turns against him. The trolls sort of come out of the woodwork, start saying things like, you only wanted to find your parents so that you could get money out of them, so that they would buy you a house, and you know, you're just like a grifter, basically. All of this proved too much for the teenage boy. He'd been abandoned by his parents twice, and now he had no friends or supporters. And unfortunately, in January of 2022, Liu decided to take his own life. So, those are the two sort of framing cases. Obviously, they're quite shocking in their nature. They're not necessarily representative of the majority of human trafficking cases in China, but that's probably also why they had such a viral nature, because of the, you know, the shocking elements, the woman being chained up, Liu's unfortunate committing of suicide at the end of his story. But they do both possess the commonalities that a lot of these human trafficking cases have. So, first of all, they highlight the fact that trafficking in China is kind of almost an open secret. Even though people were upset about the woman's story and Liu's story, no one was really surprised, if that makes sense. No one was like, oh my god, I can't believe something like this would happen. People were able to get over the fact that that had happened very quickly. And like I said, there were other similar cases to Liu's that had come out in the past that people were already familiar with. And they also demonstrate a sort of benign negligence almost by the state as part of China's cultural attitude towards the trafficking of women for brides and children for people who are looking to have children who perhaps couldn't have any children of their own. They also, as I say, highlight some of the key regions that are going to keep coming up over and over again in the different statistics that we talk about. One of those provinces being Yunnan province, which is a province in southwest China. It borders Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, or Burma, and it's one of the provinces with the highest rate of ethnic minority groups. Around a third of the population are ethnic minorities, and also one of the highest rates of poverty. The same goes for a province called Xuezhou, which is nearby Yunnan. It's a very beautiful place. Xuezhou is actually known for its really beautiful scenery. However, it's also very underdeveloped and has high levels of poverty, and also around a third of the population is ethnic minority groups. Another province that comes up every now and again will be Guangdong province. Guangdong province is a southern Chinese province. It's one of the richest places in China for GDP per capita. There's also a lot of migrant workers who go there because that's where a lot of the factories in China are. When we talk about where the cases are prosecuted for human trafficking, where the people are actually trafficked to, Guangdong is one of those key provinces. Now that we've got sort of like the overall gist of what we're talking about, let's go deeper into the differences between the trafficking of women and the trafficking of children in China. When it comes to women, somebody in the YouTube post that I posted asking if you had any questions for this episode asked, what impact does the status of women in Chinese society have on their being trafficked? This is a very important question and is actually fundamental to both the trafficking of women and children, but we'll talk about women first. So it's quite a complicated situation because obviously in China you have male preference for various reasons. The main reason being that because of the Confucian nature of society, male children are expected to look after their parents in their old age. Only men in the past were able to inherit the land, and until today only men inherit their family's name. So if a woman gets married, she doesn't take on her husband's name, her surname doesn't change. She's kind of seen as like an outsider both in her native family and also in her husband's family. So she's kind of peripheral and sort of incidental, whereas a man is seen as kind of like the pillar of his family and vital to the continuation of a lineage. So because of this, there has been preference for sons in the past, and obviously when things like abortion and prenatal screening came to China, there was a lot of sex-selective abortion, especially during the one-child policy, so that people could have sons. And this is the case even before this has been the case for centuries. Even though people tended to look after their sons better and then the sons tended to live longer, when they became adult men, they still needed wives in order to have children and continue the lineage. So often people would be in a case where they had a son, but they would also be desperate for a wife, and there'd be no marriageable women in their village for them to marry. So they would turn to a matchmaker to go out and find a girl from wherever this person could, usually a woman that they knew, and they would pay exorbitant fees, like really, really expensive fees, just to find a woman. Oftentimes, they would not know how the woman was found. So they would perhaps assume that, you know, the other family had been given the money and the girl had come willingly, but they might not know that the girl was actually the victim of a trafficking case, whether she was sold by her own family out of desperation for money, or whether she was kidnapped and the money was just kept by the traffickers. This kind of pattern over, as I say, centuries has led to the normalization of the idea that girls, especially from poorer communities, can just be taken as brides for these men who are looking for wives. A lot of this has been able to change now because now poorer women have different opportunities. They don't just have to get married. There's a lot of migration of young women to cities, but they also have their own problems, which we will talk about in a bit. I mentioned the sex-selective abortion. So this has really exacerbated the problem, especially in the 80s and 90s, where in some rural villages, the gender imbalance could be as much as like 160 boys to 100 girls. It's interesting that for adult human trafficking cases, the majority of adults who are trafficked are actually women, whereas it's the reverse for children. But again, we'll get onto that in a little bit. If we want to discuss the size of the operation of female women trafficking in China, it's quite difficult to put a number on it. Again, because of the nature of it, because it's kind of normalized at a cultural level that women can just be bought and sold. So it's very difficult to put an exact figure on it. One study says that between 2017 and 2020, Chinese courts handled cases involving at least 1,250 women who had been victims of trafficking. These crimes often followed a similar pattern, traffickers kidnapping vulnerable women to sell as wives to men in other parts of China. This number has actually dropped. So in 2019, around 5,000 cases were prosecuted, which was down 15% on the previous year. And that's for trafficking of both women and children. It's difficult because it's obviously not very representative. The prosecution is just people who were caught, right? It doesn't actually reflect the numbers of people who were trafficked, and also the new ways in which traffickers are sort of adapting to the new socio-economic status of China and of women as well. So this is how one article puts it. Northern Jiangsu is a relatively prosperous region, but it suffers from a severe population imbalance. In 2010, the male-to-female ratio for people aged 15 to 14 in Feng County was 146, meaning that for every 2 girls born in the area, 3 boys came into the world. The population imbalance in Xuezhou, however, only exists among minors. From the age of 15 onwards, the male-to-female ratio drops dramatically. This means either a large number of men are leaving, or there's a large influx of women. In Xuezhou's case, it's the latter. The census data records no significant drop in the city's male population between 2000 and 2010, but does record over 60,000 female migrants from outside Jiangsu registered as residing in Xuezhou, 4,000 of which live in Feng County. Many young women migrate to rural parts of northern Jiangsu in particular, the census data shows. In 2010, more than 80% of the migrants who moved to Feng County from outside Jiangsu province were female. So why are so many women moving to northern Jiangsu? Overwhelmingly, it's for marriage. Around 80% of female migrants moving to rural areas in northern Jiangsu from outside the province do so to get married. It's unclear how many of the marriages are related to trafficking. The contrast with the situation in other regions, however, is striking. In southern Jiangsu, nearly 80% of the female migrants come for work. Fan Hui, a 24-year-old who grew up in Feng County, tells the newspaper that she personally knew 3 women from southwest China who had been abducted and brought to her village. The fact that the women were victims of human trafficking was public knowledge, but no one reported the issue to the authorities. This is because most locals don't view trafficking as a crime, she says, as the line between arranged marriage and trafficking is blurred. Fan says she also knew 2 kidnapped women from neighbouring villages. One was the mother of her classmate. Fan recalls visiting her classmate's home for dinner when she was in the 2nd grade and seeing the women struggling to make dumplings. One of the woman's arms was cut off at the wrist. When Fan asked her about it, the woman said that traffickers had cut off her hand as a punishment. She had tried to escape and been caught. So yeah, again, this story highlights the sort of normalization of trafficking as a cultural aspect of getting married in China. A lot of the time, these women are, again, from poor areas. They might be sold deliberately, and then they're sold to family who have sons who would be in a technically undesirable category, right? So in the story that I just spoke about, these people are in northern Jiangsu province, which is the same place that the woman at the beginning, Xiao Huamei, was living. So they might come from a poor area themselves, but they're also being trafficked to another poor area. So it's kind of like an inter-poverty situation. And they're also being sold to undesirable men. So they might be men of a certain age with very little money. They might be mentally handicapped men themselves. They might have physical disabilities, or they might just have like congenital health problems that means that they can't find a wife in a legitimate manner. So as well as the trafficking of young women from within China, something else that's sort of grown, especially with the unfortunate increase in globalization, one of the side effects of that has been the trafficking of women from other countries, places like Vietnam and Cambodia that border onto China. Oftentimes it's cheaper for a man to buy a foreign bride as opposed to paying a bride price for a native Chinese wife, where the families might expect more money, especially if they are actively selling their daughter. Also, there's less recourse to justice for foreign women. There's fewer places that they can turn to. Perhaps their Chinese isn't so good as well. So it might be considered a bit easier to get a Vietnamese wife. So there are 3 main countries where these foreign wives come from. Again, around 50% of them, one study shows, come from Vietnam, and then there are around 26% from North Korea, 20% from Myanmar. And actually there's cases where there are so many Vietnamese women in a single village that they're dubbed like Vietnamese marriage villages because of the really, really high incidence. Again, very high ratio of boys to girls, lots of women leaving to go and work in the city and find other opportunities, marry richer men. And so these men have no choice but to sort of work the land, look after their aging parents, and try and find a bride through other means. So again, initially these women are brought through Yunnan province, which makes sense because that borders onto Vietnam. However, they're then taken on to other provinces in the interior, like Anhui and Henan province, big farming regions with lots of rural men who need wives, basically. And so there is an article that kind of describes how some of these transactions end up taking place. In the recruitment stage, of the 230 victims we were able to identify, the deceptive tactics used in the trafficking process, 111 victims were told by the recruiters that they had been offered high-paying jobs in China. Interestingly, 75 victims were informed up front that they were recruited as potential brides for Chinese men. Although these Vietnamese women came to China with the intention to marry a Chinese man, they were eventually sold to strangers without their consent and forced to live in marital unions against their will. For example, a Vietnamese woman was deceived by her trafficker, May, who promised to introduce her to a rich Chinese man. May transported the victim to a village in Henan province where she stayed with a couple. May and the couple later brought her to a local man's home. She thought it was just a blind date, but she was forced to live with the man, losing her physical and sexual autonomy. So you can see that in the case of Vietnamese women, again, it's the case of them being poor, but being sold to other poor men, so who might be slightly richer than them, but they're still being deceived in a sense. They thought that they would have some say in the matter, some autonomy, some element of choice, and some of them are told that they're coming for work. So there's two different kinds of trafficking going on there. In terms of the actual transaction for a Vietnamese bride, according to this article, the average price of a Vietnamese bride was around 57,000 yuan, which is around $8,000. So it's not cheap, and it takes a lot of organization. It's a very transactional process. So there's usually no contract signed, although when there is, there's kind of like a recourse. So if your wife ends up running away, you might get a refund, or you might get like a guarantee of a second wife within 12 months. Also, the traffickers themselves use word of mouth marketing to get other clients to bring in more brides and keep their enterprise going. It's very transactional, and it definitely shows that women are being seen as commodities and used as a means of making money. Often the groups that traffic these women are, groups of around 3 to 5 men. It's not a very large operation. It's not like a hierarchical mafia sort of situation. It's kind of like local-ish people with connections in other regions who are just looking to make some side hustle money, for want of a better description, to be honest. There's a division of labor, so like someone will source the brides, somebody will like transport and store them, and then somebody will do the transaction on the other end, usually a woman, again a female matchmaker, to agree the contract with the buying family. It's a very sort of like business oriented world almost. It's not formal, but it is transactional, and yeah, it just shows that women are seen as commodities even in this modern day and age, even when women do have some authority in their own lives. In both the cases of foreign women being trafficked and local Chinese women being trafficked, there's lots of cases of women running away, and there is some recourse to justice as well. The authorities don't always turn a blind eye. If something's brought to their attention, they will try and deal with it. And also there are major crackdowns every now and again on trafficking operations in China. So here's one example of that. Not all victims are wide-eyed innocent Vietnamese women who simply fell prey to unscrupulous matchmakers or human traffickers. The probable scenario might have involved women whose rosy expectations, hyped up by the human traffickers, were dashed when they realized they were marrying into families of undesirable economic or social status. Once they found that they'd been deceived, they rejected the deal and a dispute ensued, which most likely aroused the attention of the authorities. For example, Vietnamese woman Ni was promised by a recruiter that she would marry a 27-year-old engineer in Yunnan, China. She voluntarily yet illegally crossed the border with the trafficker to meet the future husband. However, to her utter disappointment, Ni found the man to be a peasant in his 40s who suffered from paralysis since infancy. The buyer's family monitored Ni closely and threatened that her illegal immigration status would land her in jail in China. After living with the buyer for about a month, Ni ran away with the hope to go back to Vietnam. Ni did not go far before being caught by the buyer's father. On the way back home, an alert policeman noticed their suspicious behaviour and rescued the girl. But obviously this isn't the case for everyone. It's also not known to what extent women become happy. Again, some of the women know that they're coming to get married illegally. They're still technically victims of trafficking, but they're willing and voluntary participants in the process as well. They are still the commodity that is being moved about kind of on the black market. So yeah, in general, it's just a very difficult thing to track. It's clearly still a problem. The normalization of it at a cultural level is definitely something that makes it difficult for the authorities to deal with in a very direct manner as well. Let's turn back now to the idea of child trafficking in China. When we discussed the Xuezhou story at the beginning of the episode, one of the key words that I wanted to bring up was bought. Obviously in China there is such a thing as legal adoption, right? But Xuezhou and other children like him are bought either knowingly illegally or not knowingly illegally, if that makes sense. So some of the people who buy children in China know that they're doing something illegal. Some people aren't actually that aware that buying children is illegal. And again, this is because of cultural precedents in China that made the buying and selling of children a very normal cultural practice in the past. And there's also, again, there's many different types and layers of victims in child trafficking cases in China. So we mentioned that Liu had been actually sold by his parents, but I mentioned that he'd been inspired by another story, and that story is that of Xuezhou, who had a very different ending because it had a very different beginning. Zhou's parents, who lived in Shenzhen, had actively been searching for him since he had been kidnapped, had actively been searching for him the whole time he was missing because he'd been kidnapped, right? So they hadn't sold him. He had been kidnapped by traffickers. The story kind of swept the nation of the father looking for the son, and actually became the topic of a film called Dearest in China, which sort of like lays out the 14-year search for Zhou. Eventually, Xuezhou was actually found. It was a very emotional reunion that was actually captured. I think it was captured on live TV, or like there were people filming it and like the video went viral as well. The contrast between these stories shows that on the one hand, there are children who are kidnapped, and on the other hand, there are children who are bought and sold. So what's the difference? Like, what's the differential there? How common is one versus the other? Now, again, it's very difficult to put numbers on this. So many children are, because they are sold, they're not reported missing, or even kidnapped children aren't reported missing for whatever reason. So it's difficult to get a handle on the numbers, right? One article seems to suggest that, again, this is due to like the Confucian feudalist nature of traditional China that's sort of been carried over into the present. In feudalist China, children were regarded as the property of their parents, and the selling or buying of children was legally and morally acceptable until the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Today, the child trade is explicitly prohibited, but child trafficking remains a social problem that has survived even the economic reforms that started in the late 70s. That cultural acceptance part is quite important, because often the people who buy children are not socially condemned even after it comes to light that they have illegally bought their child. Again, some people don't know it's illegal. In general, these people tend to get a lot of sympathy because perhaps they weren't able to have their own child, or they just wanted another child as well. It seems that with the end of the one-child policy and more active attention by the police, probably because of these large social media stories, the cases of active child kidnapping have decreased. Annual child trafficking cases have been decreasing year by year since 2012, down nearly 90% from 5,900 that year to 666 in 2020. A 2020 data analysis by Caixin of posts on Baobei Huijia, or Baby's Return Home, China's largest information registration site for lost children, found that a larger number of children went missing in the late 90s and late 80s, with fewer registrations seen in the 21st century. Where do these children come from? There's kind of three sources of trafficked children, if you will. So it seems that the majority of children are taken from migrant families. So they're either children who have come with their migrant parents to work in a city and have been left unsupervised during the day because the parents can't find adequate childcare, so they're kind of like left in the community to play with the other kids. They're largely unsupervised and they're easy prey for somebody who's just looking to pick up stray kids, essentially. Some of them are the sort of left behind children, that's what they're called in China. So people whose parents have gone to the city to work and they stay behind in their village with their grandparents. Again, the grandparents aren't exactly equipped to look after them very well. They also have to work on the land. The children are running around unsupervised. Again, easy prey for somebody who's looking to snatch up an unwitting child. Some parents are coerced into it, either under threat of violence or other retribution. Some people have been murdered in cases of child kidnapping. And then you have cases where children are deliberately bred in order to be shipped off to other parts of the country in order to pay for a family's expenses. An actual breeding village was actually once found in Yunnan as well. So again, like women, the kind of organizational aspect of the operation is divided in between different people. So you've got the people who source and the people who source buyers, and then the sort of like middlemen who like move the kids around. But unlike the women trafficking cases, these organizations can be really huge. Child trafficking makes a lot of money. And so you can have organizations, usually kinship relationships, right? So again, if we go back to our episode on Guanxi, a lot of these people are people who are related to each other in one way or another, who form this kind of like clan. So this is a bit more mafia-esque, if you will, that just works in trafficking children. An organization can have like hundreds of people in it, and most of them, again, they're sort of uneducated or undereducated. They're from poor areas themselves, and so this is a way for them to make money because they don't have other legitimate means of making a good income, essentially. So far, we've only really talked about children who have gone into homes to be adopted, especially male children. Again, male children, I think, make up 2/3 of trafficked children, usually to families who want a male heir. They're not able to have one themselves. However, obviously, female victims are also trafficked. Also to families who can't have children. Some people want a daughter just because they want a larger family, not because they might already have a son. But the idea of having a large family, again, is still like culturally a good thing in China, despite things like the one-child policy, especially in rural areas, again, where there is no like social safety net, there's no social provisions from the state. You will need more children in order to provide for you as you get older. However, female victims of child trafficking are more likely to go into things like sex work, working as prostitutes, either on the streets or in like hotels and like massage parlors and things like that. And a lot of them are also brought as child brides. So they are brought into a family that has a son, so that when they grow up, they can marry that son. And in the meantime, they're kind of used as child labor to help with chores and things around the house. They're not treated like a loved daughter or anything like that. They're kind of treated, again, as a commodity. So again, you have this difference between boys and girls. Boys, even if they're sold into poor families, are more likely to be treated as a son, whereas girls are a commodity, to be bought and sold kind of at will, with the hopes that they don't run away. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's actually being done about trafficking in China. Like I mentioned earlier, the 2 cases that we spoke about came to public attention through social media because of, this new age thing that we can now use to bring certain situations to public attention, both national and international. The police are now more likely to intervene in these cases and actually do something about it. In general, I think it just brings attention to the problem. People might not have even known that this was a problem in China, or they might have known that it was happening but not known that it was illegal, like we discussed earlier. So let's talk about Liu's case first. A few hours after Liu's death, police in Datong said on social media that they would investigate Liu's claim that his parents had sold him. The police had helped him locate his birth parents a month earlier, and results of the investigation would be made available to the public. Yang Weidong, a law professor at Chinese University of Political Science and Law, said, "The public noticed a single incident on the internet. The observations turned the incident into a heated debate, and government agencies responded. This is a brand new way of the public taking part in state governance." Liu Leming, associate professor at East China University of Political Science and Law, said, "In the past, media reports would draw the focus of the government agencies to social problems or incidents. In this way, a news event occurring in a certain location gets to be more known by people across the country. In the internet era, everyone has the right to post and share what they see and how they feel. This process has become faster and easier, meaning that the government agencies have to follow up and respond more quickly. In the case of Liu, Datong police acted quickly. They acknowledged that they had received a report from netizens, stated that an investigation into Liu's parents had already been launched, and added that further information would be disclosed to the public. Liu added, "Solving heated issues is a way for the government to achieve better performance." So the police were actively trying to investigate the sort of course of Liu's selling and buying. But in this process, something that's highlighted is the role of the people who buy children. So obviously they drive the market, right? Without any buyers, there wouldn't be any sellers. But often these are just desperate families who do actually take very good care of the children that they buy. So a question that people have raised is like, well, what's an appropriate punishment for these sorts of people? So if we look at the case of Xuezhou, He'd been with his parents for 14 years. And actually, even though he found his biological parents, he decided to stay with his adoptive parents. But his biological father wanted to sue his adoptive parents. And so this highlights like disparities within the law where traffickers can get, life sentences in prison, whereas people who buy children can get a maximum of 3 years. And looking after the children well actually sort of lends credence to their case that, they didn't think that they were doing anything wrong and they only had the interest of the child at heart. Something that I discovered during this research is that there is no child protective agency in China. There's no like child protective services or any service that is specifically employed to look after children's rights or children's health, children's mental health. So a lot of the time with these trafficking cases, the children are actually returned to their biological parents if they're still kids. But if you've been sold by your parents who don't want you, there's quite a high chance of, say, recidivism. So your parents might sell you again, or you could end up being abused. Even if you are sort of fostered out into the foster system, again, there's high cases of children then being abused by their foster families or adoptive families. There was a case recently that I don't even want to talk about, but essentially a 6-month-old child had been killed by her adoptive parents. So there's lots of like horrible things that can happen, but there's very little follow-up from the government agencies. It's kind of like, here's your kid, and nothing to support the child, nothing to follow up with the child's health and well-being afterwards. It's kind of like a case closed issue. So that's one major thing I think that needs to be reformed for child trafficking. You can solve as many cases as possible, but you are going to have repeat offences if you don't follow up with the children and their families, if you don't have that proper education in place, and if you don't have the support for victims of trafficking who might be suffering from trauma related to any abuse that they've suffered, or just the fact that, their parents who aren't who they thought they were. We see this immediately in the first example that we talked about Xuezhou. He was abandoned by everyone. He was judged by the public as well. He was bullied for being adopted. So there's lots of like cultural level issues and societal level issues that need to be sorted out in the case of child trafficking in order for the loop to close, essentially. Like, you can solve as many cases as you want, but they're just going to keep on reoccurring if you can't get to the heart of the matter, which is the fact that at a cultural level, nobody cares that the kids are being trafficked, right? That in itself is not seen as an issue. You're punishing the people, but you're not punishing the action itself or the practice of buying and selling children. And because of that, like, who knows how much of it is still going on? Who knows how long it will go on for as well? So if we go back to the trafficking of women, so in the case of Huamei, the police did find the people involved. They did send her husband and I believe 5 or 6 other people to prison, but her husband only got a 9-year jail term or something like that, which is obviously caused a lot of uproar on social media. He has stolen her entire life, and yet he only gets 9 years in prison for all of the harm that he's caused her. And it seems that she's currently receiving psychiatric treatment. The last update was that she's sort of been placed in care, and she's with her eldest child, who is sort of helping to support her through recovery, although it's not clear how well she'll be able to recover considering the state that she was found in. In response to this case, because there was still like ongoing furor about it online, the police and the authorities basically said that, we're going to try and crack down on the trafficking of women in China. However, despite their proclamations, if you will, those who sort of advocate for women's rights in China, women's rights activists, have not been very hopeful about the prospects of, the end of the human trafficking problem anytime soon. So Guo Jing, a domestic violence caseworker in China, said that it's typical for authorities to treat gender-based crimes as one-off incidents, solved by catching and punishing the accused. These incidents are not viewed from the structural point of view. There is no long-term perspective, nor institutional solutions. In March, some party members at the National People's Congress suggested strengthening laws protecting women and increasing punishments for human trafficking. But these have yet to materialize, and the Chinese Communist Party leadership has not signaled any changes. Meanwhile, censorship has increased. In the wake of the Tangshan attack, Weibo removed the accounts that incited gender confrontation. Older threads about the chained woman, which often included discussions about sexism, have also been wiped. That article also references something called the Tangshan attack. This was a case that was caught on CCTV footage of like 30 men or something absolutely ridiculous. Just a group of men basically dragging these women out of a restaurant and beating them in the street, like to the point where they were hospitalized. I don't think anyone died, but I will put that in if they did. I'll link to articles about it in the description as well. But essentially, this became a huge case about how the patriarchal society in China basically engenders the kind of behavior where women can be treated as objects. It's kind of masculine to abuse women. It's not seen as something that you're doing that's wrong ever. Like, again, at a cultural systemic level, the act itself or the ideas of hurting a woman are not seen as a bad thing. Domestic violence laws only came into effect in like 2015 in China. So again, that's not enough time really for the cultural aspect of attitudes towards women to have flipped over completely. And then the article also mentions the problem of censorship. We've discussed in previous newsletters as well about things like Me Too activists. I think we've also got a podcast episode about Me Too activists being disappeared. A lot of them have never been seen again. Social media accounts being banned, hashtags being scrubbed from the internet. So China is not a place where you can openly talk about this problem either. At a very fundamental level, to answer the person's question, who I mentioned at the start, women are treated quite badly in China. They are seen almost as second-class citizens. So women have equal rights to education and healthcare and, finances and whatnot. However, women are just seen as lesser beings in society. They're less, especially in traditional rural parts of the country, they're less wanted by their families. They're still seen as the problem when it comes to like, oh, why has this family not had any sons? It must be the woman's fault. And if you don't have any sons, you're treated badly. If you do have sons, you're treated better. Women are still judged on their appearance when it comes to things like getting a job as well. And then we spoke about in the episode, I think it was the Guanxi episode, we talked about how women are treated in the workplace, especially young women who have to attend these drinking parties and things like that, how they're kind of forced or coerced into very uncomfortable situations. So at the fundamental level, there is a problem in Chinese culture about how women and also children are regarded in society. They're kind of seen more as property than autonomous beings. In my opinion, unless these cultural attitudes are resolved and these people are seen as equal citizens with equal rights, you can't really tackle the problems of human trafficking at a fundamental level, because it's about the attitude. It's not even seen as illegal by some people. So if people don't even feel that what they are doing is bad, then it doesn't matter what punishment you met out for it at sort of like a governance level. If there's no societal level punishment, no rejection from society because you're doing something morally reprehensible, then it will continue to happen, possibly forever. So on that happy note, that's the end of this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. It was a little bit light on facts and figures, again, just because it was really hard to find. But I hope you enjoyed sort of like the more thematic discussion around it, if you will. I don't want it to be like, oh, there's a huge human trafficking problem in China and like millions of people are being trafficked every year. I don't think it's as bad as that, but I do think that the cultural systemic problems are very interesting given how people are reacting to it on social media when these cases do come to light. So if there are any interesting cases that you've heard about, please do leave a comment in the comments section and let me know, or write to me and I can mention it in future episodes as well. The next episode is going to be a lighter topic. We're going to talk about what is socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's obviously a phrase that comes up all the time, especially when we're talking about modern politics. So I thought it would be good to actually give a definition of that phrase so that when we talk about it in the future, you know exactly what I'm talking about, you know exactly what the CCP is talking about, and any plans that the CCP or the Chinese government makes in the future make a lot more sense. You've got that context, and you don't have to be like, they've said socialism with Chinese characteristics, but I don't actually know what that means, but I'm just going with it. Because that's what most people do, and that's why most people don't really understand China. Don't forget that Sinobabble also has a newsletter, which you can find over on Substack. We also have a Twitter account that I post on very infrequently, but I'm there. Give this episode a like on whatever platform that you're watching on, whether it's YouTube or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you are. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks, bye.